After the unsatisfactory victory at Lobositz in early October of 1756, Frederick was determined to get to grips with the Austrians in the following year. In early March, Frederick realised that the French and Russians would not be a problem until later on in the year. This would give him a window of opportunity to isolate the Austrian army and potentially remove a major player from the war. The initial Prussian plan was to attack with 4 columns into Bohemia. Moritz von Adler-Dessauer and 20,000 men would advance down the river Elbe, while Frederick, with the main army of 40,000, would advance directly on Prague from Dresden, and the other 2 columns, the first, 20,000 men under Beven's command, would cross into Bohemia and advance via Reichenberg. The second column, Schwerin, in command of 34,000 troops, would be coming from Silesia. The Austrians were also deployed in 4 areas across Bohemia with around 110,000 men. Brown's initial plan was to go on the offensive, but this became hopeless when the indecisive Prince Charles assumed overall command of the Austrian forces. The Prussian advance in mid-April came as a surprise to the Austrian army, as the only actions prior had been some minor raids. Schwerin was the first to move, crossing the Reichenberg on the 18th of April en route to link up with Beven's command. In the face of this advance, the Austrian column under Sebolini withdrew and made no effort to impede the Prussian movement. Meanwhile, Beven's advance towards Reichenberg led to an engagement with the Austrians, in which the experienced Prussian commander inflicted a defeat on the Austrians, capturing large quantities of supplies, and then continued his march on towards Prague. Meanwhile, further west, Prince Moritz began his march to join Frederick. Arenberg's Austrians were still on the Eger in an attempt to delay the Prussian advance. Field Marshal Brown was determined to draw the Prussians to battle on the lines of the River Eger. However, the Prussians marched through the night and crossed the river using pontoons. Brown withdrew towards Prague, where Prince Charles of Lorraine arrived to take command of the Austrian forces. The 2 generals almost came to blows, deciding on a strategy to fight the Prussians. On the 30th of April, the Austrian army withdrew closer to Prague, followed by the Prussians. Frederick left 32,000 men on the west bank of the Moldau to stop any Austrian escape, and decided to attack the Austrian army on the 6th of May. The Austrian army formed up for battle just east of Prague, with its left wing commanded by Prince Charles anchored to the river and stretched eastwards along a plateau, with the right wing facing southeast under Brown's command. The Austrian army was around 70,000 strong, including around 11,000 cavalry and 61 heavy guns, mostly positioned on Brown's wing. Frederick spent some time in the early morning hours observing the Austrian position. He ruled out a frontal attack, as the terrain would disorganise any attack they attempted, even for the well-drilled Prussian infantry. It was discovered that the plateau around Brown's position on the Austrian right was of better ground to launch an attack. Frederick's plan was to turn the Austrian right flank, which meant most of his army had to march east and then south to form up for the attack. At around 10 AM, the Austrians realised what the Prussians intended. In response, Brown ordered some 3,000 infantry and around 5,000 cavalry to bolster his weakened flank. The Prussian army was still deploying, but Frederick's army was around 64,000 strong, with around 14,000 cavalry and 82 heavy guns. The main bulk of the infantry under Schwerin's command was positioned to attack Brown's wing, set up in 2 lines, and flanked by around 5,000 heavy cavalry. Zieten's cavalry, mostly made up of hussars, had spent the morning hours marching further south in the main Prussian line, and was well positioned to flank the Austrian cavalry. The rest of the Prussian army was threatening both Charles and Brown's flank in the north, under Manstein's command. Schwerin, commanding the Prussian left, was determined to strike the Austrians before they could fully reinforce their line. He began by launching his cavalry at their Austrian counterparts in the south. The battle raged back and forth, without much to show for it. The Prussian infantry advanced in the Austrian lines, though the rough ground slowed and disorganised the attack, plus the 60-odd heavy guns bombarding them from the plateau inflicted heavy losses on the attackers. The initial attack was a disaster, as the Prussian infantry had to endure heavy artillery fire on the route, and then disciplined musket volleys from the Austrian infantry, causing many a Prussian battalion to flee the battlefield. It got worse for the Prussians, as General Winterfeld, leading forward a battalion, was hit in the neck and fell from his horse. Schwerin, in an attempt to rally the men, grabbed a regimental colour and rode forward, immediately taking a mortal blow from Austrian canister fire. The Austrians, seeing the crumbling Prussian lines, counterattacked down the slopes, but as they did this, a gap opened up on their left, and 6 Prussian battalions pounced and began to roll up the Austrian line. Meanwhile, further south, the cavalry battle was still raging, but at around 11:30, Ziethen's cavalry appeared on the Austrian flank, routing most of the cavalry. The Austrian right wing was in a disastrous position, with cavalry rolling up one flank and infantry up the other. Brown, attempting to rally his infantry, was struck down by a cannonball and mortally wounded. The rest of the Prussian infantry began their attack on the Austrian left. The defending infantry were gradually pushed back, but held firm with support from the remaining Austrian cavalry. This managed to keep the Austrians at bay while the rest of the army retreated towards Prague. The battle had been a costly victory for Frederick, losing around 14,000 men, in comparison to the Austrians' 12,000. Also losing some of his most competent and loyal commanders like Winterfeld and Marshal Schwerin. I'll be using Twilight of the Soldier Kings to refight this Battle of Prague. It's fast becoming my go-to rule set for the 7 Years' War. I plan to do a video in the future, going into more detail into the rule set. The battle begins in a similar fashion to a historical battle, with the Prussian cavalry engaging their Austrian counterparts in the south. Meanwhile, Schwerin's infantry begin their slog towards Brown's line, with artillery shells from both sides mowing down ranks of men. The cavalry engagement starts well for the Prussians, pushing back a unit of cuirassiers and then causing some confusion in the Austrian line. The two lines meet in the centre as the Prussians attempt to get into close range, as they come under heavy fire from Austrian volleys and artillery fire. It goes from bad to worse for the Austrian cavalry in the south as Ziethen's hussars appear on their flank. Gaps begin to appear in the centre as Schwerin attempts to rally his men, almost being wounded in the process. Ziethen's flank charge proves decisive in the south, dispatching the remaining Austrian cavalry and turning to face Haddock's reserve. As the firefight in the centre continues, Frederick orders some of his infantry in the north to pressure Brown's now weakened left flank. Haddock's cavalry reserve attempt to counterattack Ziethen's wing, but these outnumbered hussars prove no match for the elite Prussian heavy cavalry, who appear unstoppable in the early turns of the game. Brown manages to get a unit of grenadiers formed up to slow down this onslaught. They manage to hold on for a few turns, but without their flank secure, become easy pickings to the Prussian horse. However, the centre has swung the other way, with Schwerin's infantry pulling back in disarray, allowing Brown to move some of his infantry to stem the tidal wave of Prussian cavalry now threatening his flank and rear. Historically, Brown was killed attempting to organise a defence, but not today, Flipping history on its head, Brown is in the thick of the fighting, rallying units left and right without a scratch. Finally, around midday, Charles begins to move fresh infantry to support Brown in the north. As the battle seems to be going decisively in the Prussian favour, a stroke of bad luck as a fresh infantry unit rolls a double one for morale and routes in the face of Austrian muskets and heavy artillery. Frederick attempts one last attack for his remaining infantry and cavalry in the north to try and break the Austrian line. But again, more bad luck for the Prussians as another relatively fresh unit rolls poorly and is removed from the table. The Prussian cavalry under Zieten begin to crumble as around 5,000 Austrian infantry formed into makeshift squares on the high ground cause some issues. And yet again, the luck shines on Brown's infantry as yet another Prussian infantry brigade rolls a double one for its morale chest and is removed. With most of these threats on his line removed, Brown orders his remaining infantry and artillery to retreat towards Charles's wing. Though if the final Prussian attack in the north is successful, the Austrians could be in the receiving end of a disastrous defeat, but it is not to be. Just like he did historically, Manstein is killed leading his men forward, stopping all Prussian momentum. Frederick calls his men off, allowing the Austrians to retreat in good order back towards Prague. The Prussians are victorious at a cost of 13,000 men, inflicting around 12,000 on the Austrians. Just like historically, this is arguably a Pyrrhic victory for Frederick, not the decisive victory that he sought. But both sides did end up with some notable casualties, but Marshal Schwerin and Field Marshal Brown both survived. Anyway, thanks for watching this refight of the Battle of Prague. Feel free to comment any suggestions or questions in the comments, and I will try and get back to you. Hopefully I'll see you in the next one.